Okay, great. So it looks like we've managed to allow most people into the webinar now. So first and foremost, thank you all very much, especially at lunchtime, for taking the time out to join us today. We've been looking forward to this as an event for some time. If you go back over some of our previous webinars, you'll see that we've talked about BPSS quite a lot, but probably not in the way that we're going to chat about it today. I won't take Bhumi's thunder and do his introduction or the introduction of our guest speaker on their behalf, but what we've hoped to present to you today is our views on how BPSS is evolving. So we all know what the standard is, we all know what it looks like, we all know what it aims to deliver and its purpose, but we're seeing now more so than ever lots of evolution of that standard and how we're able to adapt some changes to that process to allow for a really strong candidate experience and hopefully a much more efficient process, quicker turnaround times, and ultimately happier candidates. So that's the aim of today. By way of introduction, my name is Kerry Redmond. I'm the head of growth here at Giant Screening. I've been in the industry for the last 15 years, and I was chatting to the guys not so long ago about this, but my career actually started producing BPSS documents for one of the major defence organisations. So I feel like I've gone on a real journey with BPSS throughout my entire career, where I've literally gone from those questions that are ingrained in everybody's minds around the integrity of candidates right the way through to presenting webinars like this. So it's a real lovely full circle moment, but really interested and excited to see the changes and the evolutions that we're able to chat through today. So I'll hand over without further ado to Bhumi, our fabulous compere and expert for today. So Bhumi, over to you to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Kerry. And with that introduction, I should be doing these sessions more often. So, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I think someone might be on mute, or I can hear someone. I don't know if everyone's not on mute. Sorry, I just had a bit of feedback there. So, yeah, sorry for everyone. So thank you for your time and joining today's session. As Kerry mentioned, I'm one of the screening consultants at Giant, and it's very rare that I get to participate in these sessions, and especially one such as today's, which is very close to my heart, based on the number of organisations I work with who have a particular requirement for BPSS in the UK. So being able to speak to you about its evolution and the impact of BPSS across various industry sectors is very exciting, and also as well being able to do that alongside one of our long-term and trusted partners, Konfir, is equally exciting. So as Kerry mentioned, I'm not going to steal Tom's thunder. I'm going to hand over to Tom to do a bit of an intro about himself and Konfir.
This is the bit where we're hoping it all works. Tom, are you there and available to do a quick introduction? Just while Tom's making his way through the process of just being able to chat, I'll just briefly explain Konfir and the solution that provides. But Konfir is a technology that we've been working with now for some time, and it's really helped us on the evolution of BPSS. And what it does is it's technology that allows us to utilise best practice information that's driven from a number of different government sources to ensure that the standards of BPSS are met. What that does is it allows direct to source information to ensure that the speed and turnaround time of the candidate's information is available much quicker, much more accessible, and it also is very light touch for the candidate. So when you add that into the BPSS overall process, it means that the turnaround times and candidate experience is much more effective. So that's the product that Tom and Konfir are able to deliver and have been doing for some time. And as Tom goes through when he joins us very shortly to explain his role in this, Konfir we've gone on a real journey with over probably the last 2 years, where we originally tested on a very small population within the BPSS space. It then ultimately became very successful. We chose to roll that out to all of our organisations, and we see real success from that now, and that's really the basis of today's webinar. Hi, Tom.
Hi there.
There we go. I've just done a very brief overview of Konfir, so I think I've probably done your introduction for you. Just conscious of time, if we move on, and then Tom will loop you back in very shortly, if that's okay.
Yep, sounds good.
Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kerry. So as we've mentioned, just going to cover off a few points hopefully during today's session. So for those who may not know who we are or not had the opportunity to work with us, we'll just go through a bit of an overview of Giant Screening. I promise you won't be too salesy on that front. We'll then move into the main part of today's session, which is exploring BPSS in more detail, then how that's evolved to where we are now, and as Kerry mentioned, how we are facilitating that process with partners such as Konfir to deliver those checks. We'll then go through some of the risks of BPSS, and in that respect, those risks where a robust process has not been implemented, and some of the things that you need to be aware of as organisations who may well be looking at BPSS to implement or currently going through that process as an organisation. And then what we'll then do at the end is open the session up to the attendees today to ask any questions that you may have around the content of today's meeting, or anything that you may well want to cover off related to BPSS. We have got some initial questions that we are going to share with the attendees, just to get your understanding of BPSS and also your elements of exposure to BPSS as well. We will launch a second question around your understanding again at the end of the session. Hopefully your understanding will have improved. If it isn't, this will be the first and last time I'll be asked to participate in a BPSS or a webinar session, shall we say, but it'd be good to see everyone's understanding of that. So I will launch those polls in a moment, but without further ado, I'm just going to move on to an overview of Giant Screening.
I think as well, just before you do that, Boomy, just to mention on the Q&A piece, anybody who's done a webinar with me before, there's lots of old and familiar faces on. I'm not saying you're all old. There's lots of old contacts, familiar faces who have thankfully joined us today, and lots of new faces as well. Questions are welcome throughout. Some we may choose to answer as we go through if it's relevant to the topic. Others we may wait until the end. So feel free, if at any point in time there is a question relevant to what we're talking about, just add it into the Q&A box. You'll be able to see that. Boomy, I'll bring the questions up just so you don't feel you have to share them on the screen, and then we will we'll carry on from there. So Boomy, I'll hand over to you to do the introduction.
Okay, thank you that. So thank you, Kerry. So I just want to make sure I'm
Boom, you're on mute.
So for those people who are in today's webinar who may not be aware of Giant or not the opportunity to deal with us previously, so Giant Screening as an organisation are widely seen as one of the global leaders in background screening, and we're proud to work with a number of different clients across various industry sectors, both in the private and public space. And as I mentioned, this is a true global offering. So whilst UK is where we see a large portion of our clients situated, we are starting to see a lot more organisations come across to us on that global footprint. We'll touch on it in a bit more detail over the course of today's session, but a lot of what we've seen as an organisation is how those background checks have been delivered or are being delivered, and we're proud to see the turnaround times, which does happen to be quite a point of frustration for a lot of organisations, has come down significantly for quite a lot of checks born through a number of different solutions and services. And that commitment to service delivery we're proud to have a long-standing relationship with a number of our organisations moving forward. So yeah, that is us in a nutshell. So I'll hand over to Kerry now to go into the main part of today's session, which is BPSS in a bit more detail.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Boomy. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, no problem. 1 minute. Sorry.
So looking at the poll results there, the level of understanding and knowledge of BPSS is probably where I expected it to be across the board, really. So I'll aim my explanations around a basic to sort of moderate understanding of BPSS. If anybody feels like I've not covered anything appropriately, then the Q&A box is in the session. Bimi, are you able to just share those slides again for me, please?
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect,
sorry, Kerry.
Thank you. Okay. So BPSS, what do we know about it? What is it and what is it aimed at being? So we'll talk about the basics of it first, and then we'll talk about how the evolution of that is taking place. So BPSS was set out by the UKSV, so the UK National Security Vetting Standard, the government agencies, in order to provide a framework to identify whether individuals had the honesty, the integrity, and the right values to be able to work on high-profile government and public sector organisations, projects. So that can be anything from within the defence space through to healthcare, through to lots of other different types of projects and programmes that are all running with some footprint within the public services, public sector space. It also underpins our national security programme. So it's the very, very early basic steps to gaining more substantial levels of clearance. That might be security clearance, or it might then be a further level of developed vetting, which is accessed at much higher levels for very, very specific types of work within the UK. There's a stat that floats around that approximately 10% of the United Kingdom hold an SC clearance. Approximately 5% of those individuals have a DB clearance. So it's a very, very small population of people in the UK who hold those levels of clearance. But anybody who does hold that also has a BPSS, and that is often refreshed from site to site. Just picking up on a quick question that's come through there because it's relevant to what we're talking about. I've just been asked, where can employees find their BPSS status and its expiry date? So BPSS is only as valid as the project that you're working on. So BPSS, unlike SC and DV, doesn't carry from project to project with you. It is generally only recognised by the project that an individual is currently working on. So if an individual moves to a new company, then the BPSS would need to be done from scratch again. It's called a refresh, so a new BPSS would be done. Typically, if an individual is on a site for a prolonged period of time and they're at a BPSS level of clearance, that organisation may choose to renew certain components of that BPSS during that process. So they may choose to renew the criminal record aspect of it every 12 months, every 3 years, or every 5 years, and that bit is very much dependent on the organisation and particular guidance that they may have received from any regulators that they may be subject to. So expiry date isn't valid as such because it is generally valid for the length of the project, but people do choose to update specific elements of it, particularly in relation to right to work as well, as time goes on. But a fresh one would need to be done for every project that the individual works on or every company that the individual works for. So we've talked about the purpose of it. We've talked about really what that aims to do. It aims to protect our government's assets. It aims to minimise the risk to our national security. What we are seeing, and from a sales team perspective, I know our sales team are very good at this, they aim at recommending it as best practice. So where an organisation doesn't necessarily have a particular framework, a particular regulatory body that they're bound by, or they don't really have any experience with doing onboarding solutions within their organisation, it's generally a very good starting point for us to recommend as a best practice solution that will sort of tick all of the key boxes. It's robust in its nature, so it allows for that best practice to be rolled out, and it also ensures that the ongoing maintenance of that individual's integrity can be monitored through things like I've just said, repeating various components of those checks. And I thought one of the really interesting things, you can see a graph on the screen there, and as I alluded to very early on, I've been in the BPSS space for a long time now, and it was very much relevant to the project that an individual was working on. It was very much directed by the government at the time. But I think since projects such as HS2 mandated that their supply chain had to do BPSS, I think that was a very pivotal moment in the BPSS world, and that obviously was going back some time now. BPSS then started to become of interest to lots of different organisations, perhaps outside of that public space. And the trend that you can see from the Google trend analysis there supports that. So you can see the interest in that slowly increasing as time goes on. So I just thought that that was quite interesting to show that really as an overall framework, this is really starting to become and gain traction with, you know, that best practice. And it also allows us to apply that globally as well. I think that's a really important feature. So for organisations where they have global reach, jurisdictions outside of the UK, many of the components within BPSS can be replicated for other countries, other jurisdictions. So it allows them to have a very similar screening process across the globe. Some checks may be standard in some countries, other checks may need to be adapted slightly so they're fit for purpose for that specific country. But right across the board, it generally does give that well-rounded approach to onboarding high volumes and regulated candidates. So if we move on, thanks, Boomy. So this is where we really break down what the components of BPSS are, and I'm sure everybody on the call has seen this in some way, shape or form before. And I think this is where we start to loop Tom in and our guest speaker for today, because a lot of the evolutionary topics are in relation to the components. So it's how we are adapting those components to make the solution that bit more streamlined, that bit more effective, the integrity of the data, you know, very much is reliant on the evolution of some of the different ways and means we're able to go about that. So first and foremost, if we take identity verification and right to work, because the two are very much coupled alongside each other. And again, many people on the call will have been used to the changes that were implemented around IDSP, so the digital identity frameworks and the service providers who are able to identify the various differing technology solutions that are fit for purpose. That fits nicely into BPSS because two of the core foundations of BPSS are the identity verification of an individual and also the validation of their right to work. So through the technology that we utilize, we're able to use biometric face matching technology that links to an individual's selfie image, and it feels strange using the word selfie on what is quite a formal webinar, but ultimately we're engaging with candidate networks who are very used to that terminology, that wording, and I think it makes it that bit more usable. Our average turnaround time around things like that has become much more effective, much quicker, because it's meant that the technology has been fit for purpose. It's been much more user friendly. And I think going back to, you know, times gone by, right to work processes were a burden on lots of organisations. Yes, legally they had to be done, but actually the time that took and the intensity of and the pressure on talent and HR functions, it's been much more streamlined in the recent years just through things like digitifying, I think I might have just made that word up, digitalising right to work, and then the subsequent identity verification as well, including validating somebody's identity and their address and where they live and things like that. So it's made it much more adaptable and approachable. From a criminal records perspective, we all know that regardless of an individual's location, they are subjected to the criminal record element of the BPSS. This bit has become much more streamlined as time's gone on. We know that average turnaround times on criminal record checks are now much lower than they ever have been before, and in some cases criminal record checks and right to work checks are being turned around in less than 24 hours. In some cases, we know that individuals may have travelled outside of the UK for the periods longer than are defined within the standards, the HMG standards, but we also have ways and means now of being able to ensure that the global process for criminal record checking is much more streamlined. We've got much more of a collaborative approach with global bodies to enable the global piece to be much more effective. And then I think the the biggest change that we've seen, the most effective solution, the most effective evolvement of the overall standard has been in relation to employment verification. And I'm going to hand over to Tom just to take us through some of the different bits and pieces that we've been able to do to really enhance the overall experience of the candidate and the user in relation to employment verification where BPSS is concerned.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. And I think that sets it up quite neatly when talking about how all the other checks have evolved over the last couple of years, in particular on the digital ID and right to work checks that were facilitated with the new trust framework for digital identities, which also actually expands to attributes. So it's worth mentioning that Konfir is actually certified to the same standard that your IDSPs are, albeit as an attribute service provider, which means that we can provide fully certified employment and gap in employment checks. In the context of BPSS, most of you know that the requirement there is to verify employment or activity history over a 3-year period. So that will include everything the person has done over the last 3 years, including any employment, any potential periods of unemployment or gaps in employment, as well as education. And so Konfir will fill the gap on instantly verifying any periods of employment or gaps in employment. And we do that by accessing with regulated connectors into sources like open banking, which is regulated by the FCA, into HMRC through a HMRC recognized integration, and then into payroll with direct relationships with over 10 different payroll providers across the country. And what that means from an employment perspective is with a user's permission, we can pull back things like the employer name, so where they were working, the start and the end dates of all of those employments, a job title where that's held in the payroll system as well, and return all of that information with the click of a button, basically. So removing the need to wait for references to come back, removing the need for or the scope for potential fraud that can sometimes be associated with documentation, or we're hearing a lot about sort of reference houses and being able to sort of buy references online recently as well. And on the gap in employment side means that you don't need to ask candidates quite as much to provide documents to evidence periods of unemployment. So that's actually a new check that we've rolled out over the last couple of weeks. That's something that will mean that you don't have to go through things like bank statements to identify things like job seekers allowance to evidence that they were sort of actively job seeking for a period of time. It also means we can pick up on things like maternity allowance and all these other types of things that will explain something about the person's personal circumstances without having to have either A, difficult conversations, or B, relying on documents or other avenues to verify those periods of time. So we've been working with Giant in partnership for over 2 years now. The solution is fully integrated into that service, and I think we'll come on to some stats in a moment, but we're seeing a really high take-up rate from a candidate perspective, because it means that they don't have to wait for those references to come back or provide all of that information necessarily, though that can be obviously baked into the process too. And it's all sort of part of the seamless experience that they will be otherwise going through.
And I think, Tom, it's fair to say, you won't mind me saying this, but Konfir in its own right is a phenomenal piece of technology, but actually this really comes into play in its own right when it's part of a wider managed service program, doesn't it? Because the ultimate experience of the candidate and how we're able to streamline that BPSS solution becomes much more effective when you've got the people utilizing the technology, doesn't it? As opposed to the technology just in its own right.
Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, we consider ourselves the experts on the employment verification piece. We're by no means the experts that Giant are on that full screening package that you need for BPSS and that you need for other types of screening packages. And so that's something that we've really enjoyed through this partnership over the last couple of years, is really understanding where this best fits in as part of different types of screening that employers need to do and that candidates need to go through to start their new roles. But then also getting the feedback from the experts on the Giant team, but also all of your customers and how they're starting to use the product. So sort of, I guess, rewind a couple of years, we started all of this with just a handful of customers through the Giant, to the integration that we built. And it's been really cool to see that evolution to rolling it out to many more employers, particularly over the last 6 to 12 months. And we've seen some great stats as a result.
Yeah, and I think, looking back, we probably didn't realise, and there's probably lots of people on this call today who are probably feeling that pain. And I think it's fair to say that the pain sits around that referencing piece, doesn't it? It's always, typically, if you can get a good right to work solution, it's criminal record checks are fairly accessible. It's the employment verification piece that seems to be, and that feedback comes through from chatting to hundreds of customers as the years have gone on. The pain point, whether it's BPSS, whether it's financially services regulated screening, whether it's airside screening, the pain point is always around the employment verification piece. But I just think so much so within the BPSS standards, it was so defined that it actually, you know, it was taking up so much time within talent functions, within HR functions, within our own internal advisor functions, that the evolution has really allowed us to free up the time of advisors, to be able to free up time of HR advisors, of talent teams, because we're able to do more validation of the information that's coming back to us rather than having to spend our time sourcing that information. And I think what that ultimately is driving is a much happier customer, but also a much happier candidate who really feels that they're embraced during that process as well. So yeah, it's always been a journey, shall we say. Just picking up on a question that's come through there. So how do we make sure that we do not discriminate against people who may have gaps in employment or permanent address due to health or other social problems?
So I can pick that up on how we verify information. So we always try and avoid oversharing data. That benefits us, it benefits candidates, it benefits basically everyone that's involved in the screening process. And so we've built out very specific non-biased insights that are built off types of payments that we can see, particularly on the banking side, but then also from a HMRC perspective, so that we can see, for example, that somebody may have had temporary work disruption, as an example, because they were receiving some kind of incapacity benefit for that period of time. So that will mean that you don't have to sort of necessarily inquire as to the why they were receiving that, but you'll understand what that piece of evidence is that has led us to giving you that kind of insight. So we'll always try and keep it as non-biased as possible. But Kerry, I don't know if you want to add to that from the service you add on top of it.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because we are often very much bound by the standard and the regulations of that standard. I think how you approach is very much the determining factor as to how that candidate feels and how they've been treated throughout that process. So for us, it's always very much about asking the right information at the right time in the right way. And by doing that, we have a policy here where we talk about a candidate is fully informed at all times. So if we ask for a specific piece of information or ask a specific question, we will always start by explaining why we're asking that. So regardless of the consent that the candidate gives and or anything to do with that, at the very beginning of the process, if we feel that it's a sensitive subject or it's something where a candidate may feel uncomfortable, we will always approach that in an appropriate manner. So it's almost utilising the technology to back up the information, but also making sure that the candidate is fully informed. We're using appropriate language and we're not over asking. So one of the big things for us, especially since GDPR has come into play, is validating the right information in line with access for the right roles. So we're not over screening candidates, we're asking in relation to the standard, and it's just about the way that is approached really is probably the most rounded response I can give you on that.
And I think the leveraging of technology piece is really the needle mover here, right? Because that's kind of what has led us to this kind of evolution, and it's been the thing that stopped us doing it any earlier. BPSS in itself lends itself really well to this kind of technology. It already calls out that you can use digital CV checking tools as part of the checks that you're doing. It even goes as far to say as you shouldn't even expect to get references back from employers a lot of the time, because either they have a policy not to do it, or at best they have a policy to just give you the factual information, which is effectively what you'd get through it's sort of an employment verification technology that Giant can provide.
Perfect. There's another question that's come through. There are a couple of others, but I'll pick up on this one just for now because it is in relation to what we're talking about at the moment. And then for those of you that have asked other questions, I will come back to them very shortly. The question that's probably most relevant at this moment in time. So Yvette says, how does the employment verification process work with third-party contractors, freelancers and self-employed individuals?
Yes, it's a good question. So First of all of the data sources that we access are consumer permissioned. So we need the person's consent and authentication to get data from a bank account, from payroll systems, and from HMRC. And we really see there being 3 different types of employees. There's full-time PAYE employees, and we can use any of those 3 data sources to access those kind of information for those people. We've then got sort of self-employment, and we typically split that demographic into 2. There's people that are self-employed that are paid through an umbrella company or a contracting agency. And for all intents and purposes, we can treat them as if they are PAYE employees because we can access data in the same way. So we'll be able to get data from their personal account through our open banking module. We can get information where they're in our payroll coverage, and of course through HMRC as well, in a similar way to how you would have previously done that through the sort of standard HMRC letters. For self-employed people, it can be slightly trickier, but we can connect both personal and business bank accounts, which will mean that you can get evidence of things like invoices or other sort of business-related transactions like grants, loans, payments to HMRC, etc., to verify sort of continuous periods of self-employment.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And just as that came through, there was then another relevant question come through. So I'll ask you this one as well, because I think again you've touched on it, but I think again that you'll have a good answer for this. So the employment verification is easy to obtain for contractors that have their own limited companies. How does that differ? Or how does that work for individuals who are utilising umbrella companies or for permanent employees?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on it, I suppose, with how we can access the data. So we can do it in all the same ways. So everything is standardized from a user experience perspective. So if they were working through an umbrella company or they're a full-time employee, the journey that they'd go through is practically identical. What we provide on top of the raw information is a comparison. So if somebody said that they were working for, I don't know, Microsoft as an example, but actually they were working for umbrella company 123, we'll show you what that difference is and where there's a discrepancy between the employer that they told you and the employer that we've been able to verify. And a lot of the time, if that is an umbrella company, you'll very quickly be able to come to the conclusion that actually they kind of told you who they were contracting to as opposed to the actual employer that they were employed through. So we'll always give you that discrepancy analysis, which helps on sort of that kind of understanding, but may also give you benefit on sort of fraud identification, because it could be that somebody told you that they're working somewhere for 3 years when we've only been able to verify through 1 or more sources that they only worked there for 1 year, or they, for whatever reason, gave you a different job title and we verified that as well. So there's a whole heap of benefits that we can provide through this kind of service that wouldn't have been possible beforehand.
And I think as well, it's really important just to highlight to everybody on the call, the utilisation of Konfir technology does not replace the referencing process that is in the original BPSS standard. So what we're not talking about here is replacing, we're talking about working around and utilising our backup plan, shall we say, at the appropriate time. So by way of explanation, what I mean by that is within the standard, we all know that there is a defined number of attempts, a defined number of times, or a defined number of approaches that organisations must make to referees of individuals to validate that they have worked where they say they work with the integrity during the dates and so on and so forth. So we're not replacing that. What we're then doing is we're working with Konfir to almost have our backup data, so information from HMRC, from various different sources, to utilise should, in the event that those original referees not come back with that information. So we're not replacing the original BPSS validation process here. We almost have the backup information accessible and ready to go should that be the case. So it's that bit that's key that has seen the turnaround times really decrease, because ultimately we know our approach beyond that point. So I think it was just to be clear on that point that we want to make sure that we are still very much in line with the standard, but we almost have this whole array of options available to us should the original options not work out for us. And I think that was just really important to highlight as well. So there are a couple of questions that have come through, a couple more questions that have come through. Thanks very much for everyone who are asking those questions. Please feel free to keep them coming through. I think what we'll do, we'll go on to the risk slide Boomy, if that's okay. Is it?
Yeah, of
we'll
course.
go over to what does this look like in practice, and then we'll talk about some of the risks, and then the other questions we'll come back to during the end because they're more generalised questions. So, the evolution of BPSS. If we just flip back one slide there, Boomy. So, we've talked about a lot of these already. Boomy, I've asked just to give a little bit of an example. So Boomy works with lots of customers in the defence space. So this was one of the spaces where BPSS is very, very rigorous for all of those customers, because ultimately those individuals will often go on and gain a much higher level of clearance. So they could end up going through SC/DV clearances, where security controllers will need the BPSS at the very beginning of the process. But ultimately, it is very much by the book, because ultimately the BPSS process is as per the HMG standard. So Boomy's worked with his customers to really improve that process, and the evolution has been really effective. So Boomy, I'll hand over to you to perhaps talk about some of the outcomes that you've seen with one or two of those customers specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. And it's been quite interesting over the last sort of year to 18 months working with a number of different clients, as you say, most predominantly in the defence space. But I think we've seen, as we saw in the earlier graph, that evolution of BPSS being implemented across different industry sectors. But in terms of my own specific experiences, I think there was a couple of challenges that the clients that I was working with were experiencing before sort of reviewing their BPSS process. I think still within that defence sector space, there are a lot of organisations that are still administering BPSS via a manual process, and also having to try and do that across various demographics. So we're talking permanent workers through to that contractor space. And when you put those two things together, that can lead to a very convoluted process, which then has a negative impact on turnaround times. So when I was in conversations with a number of clients about BPSS and how they wanted to implement that into their workforce, there was a couple of things that we needed to address and put things in place, and they were around, you know, where can we automate the sort of various checks to make it more streamlined, but also more positive for the candidates going through that journey. But also what was underpinning the whole process was the level of communication, because as you know yourself, Kerry, you know, how we communicate with our clients, but more importantly the candidates, will then have a direct impact on the success of those checks being carried out, but also completed within a timely fashion. So when we looked at that, we were saying, well, how can we do that? And I think you touched on it, you know, from the right to work. I think having that digital solution has made a massive difference in being able to signpost candidates through that journey, but also making sure that we are getting the right documentation and doing the right checks on that documentation to make sure that that individual has got the legal right to work in the UK. But then also anyone that doesn't meet that criteria, we have got the correct measures in place to signpost those back to the client to those secondary checks. Similarly with the ID verification, we all know, especially with BPSS, more often than not, organisations are going to be working in an environment where they will have access to sensitive government assets and data. So it's imperative that that ID verification is done in the right way. So again, our clients have got the confidence that the people that they are hiring as who they say they are. So we did a lot of work around that. Obviously, we've gone into a bit more detail around Konfir, but I can't understate the massive impact that had on the overall turnaround times, especially where we were working with different populations, you know, the permanent hires and the contractors, being able to bring a solution to market where a lot of those frustrations were mitigated by that automation through the HMRC payroll was, you know, I can't understate the sort of impact of that.
And I think to answer just one of the questions that have come through there, you know, the turnaround times, although specific to one or two customers there, are very much consistent across the board with lots of our BPSS customers. Vicky's asked a question that says, what's the difference in turnaround of obtaining BPSS with Konfir compared to prior, before having this partnership? And I think I'll take the answer to this one.
Yeah.
Typically it wasn't actually seen as too bad. It was
Yeah.
generally in and around that 10 to 15 day mark, which was still lower than industry standard, but we just knew that there was a lot more that we could do to make it more effective. And actually one of the things that we set out when we started working with Konfir, it wasn't aimed at reducing the turnaround time, it was aimed at improving the experience of our candidates, of our customers, and also most importantly our advisors. Our advisors had quite a lot of challenges and frustrations with obtaining references, so one of the processes that we set out to improve was the how our references obtained and what do we do with that information. So as you can see there, some of these BPSSs are turning around in 24 hours. Some of them, typically most of them, in between 5 and 10 days. Historically, that probably looked at around 15 days. So it has shaved a working week off, which is no mean feat, but it's also improved lots of other things as well in the process.
Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, so what do the risks look like then? So if a company chooses not to put this into play, if they choose not to follow the process, whether it be with the advanced evolution of technology or through the manual processes, even paper-based processes, what do the risks look like should you fail to adopt this within your business effectively?
Thanks, Kerry. And I think, as you can see on the screen, there's a few different things that I think businesses need to be aware of in terms of not having a robust BPSS process in place. I think, the identity fraud, especially if people are going to be in a situation where they have access to sensitive data and assets, it's imperative that organizations are aware of the risks. We can see there impersonation, people stealing people's identities and having access not only to financial accounts, but if they're working in a business environment, as I say, that could be access to sensitive data, which could have far-reaching negative impacts going forward. Kerry, you touched on right to work and the impact of not having an effective right to work process in place. I think for me, I always say, whilst the civil penalties, and we can see there £60,000 is quite a hefty fine to incur, I think we see the reputational damage is far more damaging and far-reaching for any companies who are found to be employing illegal workers. So again, having that effective right to work process will mitigate against a lot of that risk. And I think, as Tom touched on with the employment verification and what Konfir is able to do from a CV verification and verify those periods of employment, as Tom mentioned, people can buy references on the dark web, buy CVs. So having an effective process in place that can actually pinpoint those instances of falsifying information and making sure that we've got processes in place to highlight those at business level, that's going to make sure that the integrity of the business is protected, trust in the workforce is going to be maintained, and it's going to protect the business potentially from any insider threats, but also the external threats that we touched on over the course of today's session.
Brilliant.
The only thing I'd add to the end, I mean, we kind of touched on a few of them, but because it's an integrated solution and you get that information up front, regardless of whether the references come back, you get that complete truth of that person's employment history by going to sources like HMRC and banking. And so sometimes we see that people intentionally leave off certain employment history because there's a reason for them to do it, whatever that might be. And sometimes because people are, often contracting or hold 10, sometimes 15, 20 different jobs over a 3-5 year period, they just forget about them.
Yeah,
but because you get that information up front, it means that you are saving on speed, albeit that's sort of a positive outcome of the main focus, which is the compliance piece and making sure you're getting all the information that you need. So capturing those undeclared employments up front and capturing those discrepancies up front means that you can ensure compliance, but also sort of avoid these kind of other risks.
Thanks, Tom. And I wanted to ask one final question on the actual employment verification piece now, whilst we're in that conversation. Have you seen a shift in attitudes towards the employment verification piece from when Konfir was implemented as a potential solution to where we are today?
It's night and day. So early days, and you guys will remember this as well. It's a lot of education and informing that, you know, these are reputable technologies, these are good ways to do things, and they will have real benefits. But because it hadn't been around before, of course, it takes time for the industry to get used to it. So there are a lot more questions about the integrity and usefulness of the service as we were launching compared to today, where it's baked into hundreds of employers' onboarding processes in various forms. It could be to close off screening a bit earlier, it could be to capture fraud, or to make sure that you have that complete employment history. There's so many ways that it can add value. I'd say particularly since we've started rolling out and combining all of these data sets as well, that's where we've seen it really take off, and that understanding really sort of settle within a lot of organizations, and we're starting to see it definitely become a lot more commonplace now.
Brilliant, thanks Tom. And I just had one final question just on that. It was just around the communication piece as well, because, you know, going back to the example that we were discussing a moment ago, the key to that sort of collateral and documentation. So as a business looking at BPSS as a whole, you know, from your experience, is the communication part, you know, does that underpin everything that you would think to a successful BPSS strategy then, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think we'll come on to, or you've just said the QR code to the guide that you've put together for BPSS, including employment and gap verification, but how it all fits together is the really important point. It's one thing understanding the benefit of a particular check type, be that instant employment verification or ID verification, but it's a complete other thing knowing how that fits into your company's screening process and the standard that you need to adhere to. And so I think collectively, as we've built out that understanding of how employment and gap verification fits into BPSS or into other standards, that's where we've seen it really resonate, I think, with a lot of employers that we're working with on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Really good chat there. I think if we move on to our Q&A session now, thanks everyone who stayed with us. We've had a really good uptake actually that I can see for those that have stayed all the way through. So thank you for those who have. Anybody who wants to ask any questions, the Q&A box is open. If anybody has got any questions, there are quite a lot that have come through. If I can't answer them all during the session today, I will come back to you directly. I've already replied to some people saying I'll come back to you specifically. So a couple of questions around BPSS cost. Often that's dependent on the size and model that you want to adopt for your specific business. So again, for those of you who have asked that question, we'll come back to you specifically on that. A couple of questions around, do we have plans to have a reporting engine in the portal? We already do have quite intuitive business intelligence driven reporting that will give you end-to-end reporting, real-time information in relation to a whole host of different types of checks and candidate statuses and things like that. So that is already very much within the offering that we offer. So thanks very much for asking that question. Question from Lucy: how does the system reduce turnaround time to 1 day if there's a defined number of attempts that needs to be made to obtain references that must be adhered to? So that is often in relation to where an individual has one employment and we know that employment is not contactable, or the individual has been out of work and we know that the body that will validate that individual's period of absence from employment is contactable via the system. Or it may be that companies who choose to adopt the BPSS standard as best practice choose to utilise Konfir detail ahead of, so they do it the other way around. So they'll gain the detail from Konfir first and they'll utilise that as the green light for that individual to start, and they will then obtain the references in the background over a prolonged period of time, often not that much longer, but they do it the other way round, so it's much more effective to do it either of those two ways. Our CEO has just joined, which always makes me slightly nervous. Matt, would you like to come to the party?
I wouldn't say just joined, Kerry. I've been here throughout, enjoying some great content there, so thank you. I just wanted to pick up, there seems to be a number of questions about this defined number of chases. Just to be clear, the BPSS standard requires meaningful attempts to be made to obtain the reference from source. So that's down to for interpretation as to what meaningful works. So when Kerry talks about defined number of chases, we as a business have decided what we feel is meaningful, and that's 3 chases to the reference source before we class that as an unobtainable reference. So yeah, if you read through the standards, which sadly I have, and each time they update them, I read them as well. So that's what it's referring to. It's more of an internal measure of ours to go, what do we consider to be meaningful? But what we can do is we can jumpstart the process by putting the data in at the front end, i.e. the Konfir data. And in essence, we can pre-close the BPSS on that basis. And then we've got 3 chases, which we do every 48 hours. So we've then got a 4 to 5 day close cycle where we can say 100% those responses haven't been received, but we've already pre-validated with the Konfir data. Hope that clears that up with you. I promised Kerry I wouldn't bump in and say anything, but
no, that's okay. That's grateful for that. I saw a few questions coming through there on that. So yeah, that was going to be one of the things we were moving on to clarify around, you know, that's something we've chosen as a business to adopt in line with what the standard says. So yeah, Matt's very clear on how he wishes that to be run, and it's a really effective process, and we know that it works really well. Another question that's come through: can Konfir be used as a standalone solution for us as the employer rather than attached to giant BPSS process? Yes, is the answer to that question. But what I would perhaps say is, I'll relate it back to one of the things we chatted about earlier, is that you know, this isn't aimed at being a sales approach in any way, but it is often very much a successful solution because it is driven by people. So it is technology driven by people. But the answer to that question is yes, it absolutely can be as a standalone. But perhaps just think about the expertise that you might need within your organisation to deliver that. Matt?
Sorry, keep doing it. Yeah, and also the Konfir solution we use a lot more widely than just BPSS. So obviously today the webinar is very much about BPSS, but we have solutions across the business that involve employment verification that we use the Konfir data from, and that can be anywhere from, you know, BPSS, BS7858, or, you know, even airside. We use elements of it for there as well. But we also have service offerings where literally that's it. Some of our clients go, all we want is that data coming out. We're happy with just the HMRC data or the open banking data, and we facilitate that through the process for you guys as well. So if you wanted just that Konfir data, then yeah, reach out to us. We can do that as well for you.
Questions just come through there on how do you obtain references for gaps in employment where no work was completed? So for example, overseas travelling, caring for family, retraining in preparation for career change. How is that data captured and managed through Konfir, Tom?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were talking about the different types of insights that we can verify earlier. So that will range from things like maternity allowance to all the different types of benefits that you might be receiving, or pension allowances and things like that. So we'll identify those automatically through either a bank account or HMRC, and then present that back as part of the final report that we provide. There will sometimes be gaps in that. I mean, the 2 points that you suggested, so things like carers allowance, we can identify and then let you know that that person was responsible for somebody's care for that period of time. Things like travel is something that we're working on for a future improvement, to identify when somebody's being paid or when someone's making payments in abroad.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. I'll give one last opportunity if anybody's got any final questions. We will follow up after the webinar with everyone in case there are. I know there's some questions that we've said we'll go back to individually, so I'll make sure that we do that. But if not, we'll thank everybody very much for their time and staying with us throughout. From myself, Boomy, Tom and Matt, hopefully you've all enjoyed the session. We feel it's been really beneficial. So thanks again, and keep your eyes peeled for the next one, because this will continue to run with our series as we did last year, because we got lots of great feedback. So again, thank you very, very much for your attendance today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.